I don't think it's what people think of as California landscape, especially on the East Coast. You know, there's like some old kind of, a lot of metal, you know, things, and you know, there's some seashells and some obsidian and things that come from the earth that people will probably say, oh yeah, totally, California, man. I think really skeptical of this idea of this sort of purely mechanistic idea of artworks, where like they're little machines for you to get this thing. Like and when you find your way through, oh good, oh yeah, I totally understand it. I kind of came up with the idea of mapping a kind of route that just went up one side of California and over and down the other and back around. Basically what happened was I just drove it more or less a month of moving, collecting objects, and then sort of as my truck would fill up, boxing them up and stopping at whatever post office was local and sending them to the museum. At the end, when I got back to the museum, I had like a full truck and then all this, I mean, just this enormous amount of material, and sort of resorted it and just went from like the smaller, bigger objects down to the smaller ones. And I got it basically so that there was a horizon line through it. You know, the truck was the sort of this container, which is always in the work. I was thinking about that kind of whole collecting impulse and the saving impulse and the sort of sorting. What would it be to sort of do a work where that was the sort of, that's where the work began and that's where the work ended. A lot of things that I thought would be interesting. I thought a lot about like where spaces in cities that I find interesting, you know, like railroad areas, transit points where things are sort of falling off, right? Anywhere where there's sort of a lot of through movement, roads themselves being that, and corridors. And also deserts, which I sort of have done a lot, worked in the desert a bit, being so close here and being kind of on top of a desert. It's sort of this, you know, deserts are almost can be like pedestals for things, you know, it gets to be so wasted and flat. In order to make it be like feasible to do this, I camped. What I understand is like if you incorporate a town, any town, you have to have like certain things, and one is the post office. So a place that would be just like a campsite and a corner store would have a post office. I was looking and looking all the time, waiting for something to kind of like pop out of it or lift out of the landscape. When you drive around with a truck full of stuff, you're not going to like get a lot of people to have conversations with you necessarily, because you have like wood and rocks and things just and just all kinds of strange objects piled up. I didn't at all think of the project as antisocial initially, but it sort of became somewhat that. You just don't feel this sort of desperation that you feel when you start getting down towards Death Valley and these kind of like really wasted places, you know? Really like wiped out, kind of dry, not very good for people, not, you know, very habitable. And how that would affect one's thinking, you know? So I've been saving the material from the truck since the show to do that piece. I'm going back to Boston to do these two shows, which is really strange. Just, you know, life-wise. We are gonna dig a hole in the ground and make this horizon again with that material as this kind of landscape. Where things are, what these systems are, and then sort of pulling them into this one space, which is the sculpture, like literal space, right? They're all right here. And it sort of creates this kind of map afterwards of like where everything was, where I pulled it from, and it comes in. It's sort of, but I mean, it's not that important that the map exists, just that it collapses all of these objects into a single space that were sort of spread out like a web. Out is thinking about puzzling and sort of the space and how things lock back together, and this is a super simple piece. In terms of like sculptures that sort of become iconic. It's like a leaning sculpture without the wall part, right? It's just built, the lean is built into it. And it is, I've sort of often stayed away from this kind of Rorschaching effect, but in this case, I really wanted it to be that it's almost as if it's sort of in motion, opening and closing, that you see this happening, and the way that this sort of this gesture movement is in there. It's two separate objects stacked up, which is important to me, as opposed to them kind of being glued together or there being this other apparatus, because it's like, when you do the piece, when you installed the piece, I imagine that it was separate.
It was separate.
And then you take them and then you put it there, and then it's sort of, there it is, right? And it's like you've done the gesture to sort of activate it, and then it stands there activated. And then when you're done, you take it apart and it goes back into another form. With McCracken, I think a lot about the sort of the density of putting his sort of hands and work in and pushing the thing till it gets that kind of hyper smooth quality. And then of that object traveling around. And I think that it moves, the movement of the artwork as an object in the world, like among all these other objects, that it kind of comes here and goes there, like, but bang, there they are all of a sudden, you know? And then, like, you know, you see another one 6 months later and there it is all of a sudden, and that it be this kind of disruptive moment. That's sort of how I feel about the wall pieces too. I mean, they travel like this kind of cargo, and then like flip, and then they're done, you know? And they're still a sculpture, but they're a different sculpture. They're this kind of like dense, wrapped sculpture. It's freestanding sculpture, like a lot of the pieces, you know, you're between knowing what the objects are and not. You know, they're abstracted, but they're not completely removed. They're in that in-between space. Sort of before you do the archaeological dig, the geology and the archaeology are a single thing. It's the mass, and then you extract one from the other. Dust, pigment. It's really just like a composite material. The material starts to like just be kind of this other thing. The structure is built by the resin reacting to the dust. And I think of the dust as the objects, but it's sort of embedded so deeply.